Lesson C2, User Limits and Alerts, Topic 4, Important Things to Note. The learning objective for this topic is to understand the difference between how historians handle the current value. So our event check code looks to the current value where possible in a historian. Now the workflow of a data historian is usually that values come in and they go into a current value field, which is like a holding position. Rules are then run against this current value to decide whether to save it to the history. So those might be rules to do with compression. For example, if the value hasn't changed since last time, don't bother storing it. Or if the value hasn't changed much or within a certain percentage, don't bother storing it. Or if it hasn't changed much, but it's an hour since you last wrote something, then write the current value again. So this means that when you look at the current value in a historian, you can usually see a lot more data than is actually in the history. Now, data lakes work differently. A data lake is a replica of the history field of a data historian. So when you go to a data lake, there is no current value. The only thing you can look at is the history. And this history is updated at some period. So you may not have the very latest data in there. So this means doing event detection has to work a little differently. From a user's perspective, there is no difference. You create limits in exactly the same way, but the Eigen Ingenuity backend code works differently depending on the type of historian source that's configured. If it's a true data historian with a current value, we will create a subscription to that current value that will give us the very latest data, and we can often create an alert or trigger an alert based on a value that would not have otherwise made it into the history. For example, if the rules are configured to save a value every minute to the history, but an event happens within that minute such that the value goes high and back down again, when we make a subscription to the current value, we can spot that event. But if it's made against the history, so if it's a polled subscription against the history in a data lake, we would miss that event because it's just not available. So when there is no current value, we have to poll, we have to go and actively request to get the latest data every time and then do our checks against it. So that's just an example to be aware of how things work depending on your data source. Where possible, an event check against a subscription is always going to be the best.